Just when we thought the Chinese economy is recovering, it's getting a lot worse. In the last 3 years alone, the Chinese economy lost over $5 trillion. That's more than the entire stock market of India, one of the largest economies in the world. It's also twice the size of Russia's entire GDP, the country that's waging a war in Ukraine and is trying to kick out the United States out of Europe. The Chinese real estate market has also been a victim of this crisis. Construction of new houses in China has decreased by 60%. The reason the other 40% hasn't collapsed yet is because the Chinese government is funding it with debt. That's why China's debt to GDP ratio has almost reached 300%, the highest ever. The main reason why China's economy is slowing down is weak purchasing power. If you take a look at the economy overall, yes, it consists of maybe thousands of parts. But overall, it comes down to the fact that it's like a spinning wheel. The faster it spins, the faster the economy grows. The slower it spins, the slower the economy grows. And if it stops spinning at all, that's pretty much the end of the economy. And the reason it spins faster is because people spend money. So the more they spend, the faster the economy grows. Let's say, for example, I have $5 and I use it to buy a cup of coffee from you. You will take that $5 and you will spend it in the grocery store. The guy who sold you the groceries will take that $5 and will fuel his car. The guy who got that $5 after fueling the car will spend it on something else. That $5 will keep turning around the economy, driving the economy forward. So the more I spend, the more you will spend, the more everyone else will spend, and the faster the economy keeps growing. However, if you take a look at the data, you will be fascinated because for every $100 that the Chinese person earns, he saves almost half of it. Now compare that to the United States, where they save less than 20% of that. And the biggest challenge that the Chinese Communist Party is facing right now, that it doesn't know how to force people to spend that money. Especially when there is a crisis, governments tend to stimulate people to spend. That's why if you go back to 2020 and 2021, the US government distributed stimulus checks to the average people because people were forced to stay at home. And if they stay at home and not make money and not spend money, then the economy stops growing. And that's why it's better to kind of drive the inflation forward and distribute stimulus checks than let the economy die on its own. When the pandemic was over, people rushed to the shops, rushed to the shopping malls and start buying everything from houses to computers to iPhones to everything else. And that's what we call the post-pandemic boom. And everyone around the world thought that the exact same thing is going to happen to China when China is going to lift its restrictions. Especially China had one of the harshest restrictions in the world. And China has one of the largest populations, if not the largest population in the world. So everybody was expecting that now when China is going to lift all of these restrictions, there is going to be a boom in the demand. However, that did not happen because during the pandemic, the Chinese Communist Party did not help its citizens to survive. Everyone had to rely on themselves. So even though that the pandemic is over, people in China are afraid. What if there is another crisis? What if there is another war? What if something goes wrong? They will have to rely on their savings, which is why they're afraid to spend money, even though that everything is over and life is back to normal. And since people are not spending, the economy is not growing. The economy is slowing down. This problem has always been in China since the last 50 years at least, and the pandemic has only worsened that problem. Like if you just go back 50 years ago, China was an agricultural country, and the main focus of the government was to maximize agricultural output. But farmers don't really make that much money to drive the demand in the country, which is why the next focus of the Chinese government was to push people from agriculture to factories to drive their wages higher. And it was one of the largest revolutions in human history where hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. However, factory wages don't really make that much money to increase the domestic demand in the country. That's why what really drove the economy forward was the export market. China was producing goods at a very cheap price and exporting them to the rest of the world, especially to wealthiest countries such as the United States. And that was the strategy for the next few decades. And it really worked. China's economy started growing increasingly fast. It became one of the largest economies in the world and even overtook Japan as the second world's largest economy. But the problem with that strategy is that you're not relying on yourself. Your economy does not grow because your economy is strong. Your economy is growing because there is a huge demand for your products outside your borders. and the United States, Western Europe. What happens if these countries impose sanctions on you? What happens if these countries suddenly impose tariffs on your products? Suddenly, you don't have a market. Suddenly, no one is buying your goods and services. Suddenly, your economy stops growing because people in China are not buying what you're producing. The real people who are buying what you're producing are in the US and Western Europe. And that's the main difference between the US economy and the Chinese economy. Yes, Chinese economy has been catching up with the US economy. But unlike China, United States relies on itself. Like, take a look at the largest companies in the United States: Apple, Amazon, Google, and others. These companies do not rely on export. Yes, they export their products and services to the rest of the world. But the biggest market that drives these companies forward is the domestic market, is the market in the United States. Because most people in the US are wealthy enough and have the means to buy the products and services that these companies are producing. The biggest market for iPhones, for example, is the United States. The biggest market for Google is the United States. But you cannot say the exact same thing with China. That's why if United States cuts off China, China is in trouble. But if China cuts off the United States is not in trouble. So in order to stimulate the domestic demand, the next focus of the Chinese economy was to build massive infrastructure projects across China that will drive the domestic market forward. Since the 2008 financial crisis, Chinese export has been going down consistently, while the domestic market started growing drastically, where the Chinese Communist Party started massively building everything: airports, bridges, metro stations, planes, whatever you can think about. In just 3 years, China used more cement than the United States did in the entire 20th century. In the last 50 years, China built more skyscrapers than the United States did in its entire history. In such a short period of time, China built the largest high-speed railway network in the world. But the problem with this strategy is that at some point, an extra airport is not going to make a difference. An extra highway is not going to make a difference. In fact, there is something called the law of diminishing return, where the extra thing that you're going to build is going to make your citizens less effective. If you already have one airport there and you build a second airport next to it, maybe it will increase the productivity of your citizens. But if you build a third airport right to the next to these two airports, it is going to make your citizens less productive. The exact same thing you can say with trains, houses, and everything else. And that's how China ended up with almost 100 million empty houses. Nobody can rent them to anybody, and that is creating a serious problem in China. Especially most of it was driven by debt. Like the average Chinese would take a mortgage and buy a house, for example. The developers will take that money and build more projects. In order for that average Chinese to make his money back, he had to take that house, rent it out to someone, and that someone will pay his mortgage. But what if that guy cannot rent that house to anyone because China has built simply too many houses? He will default on his loans. And that's exactly what's happening in China. A lot of people are defaulting on their loans because they just built too many houses. So China is in that position where it knows that it can no longer drive the domestic market by building massive infrastructure projects because all of it has turned into a bubble, and it will take years for Chinese people to utilize all of what they've built over the last 2 decades. On the other hand, they haven't built an advanced enough economy where people will just spend money to drive the domestic market forward. The GDP per capita in China is around 12,500. The GDP per capita in the United States is around $80,000. So the average American is like 5-6 times wealthier than the average Chinese. And that's why the average Chinese is saving so much money while the average American is not. So the Chinese economy right now is at a turning point where it will make another drastic difference, where it will move away from building massive infrastructure projects in order to create a middle class that will drive its domestic market. And China knows that it's not in that position where it can force its people to keep spending because the economy simply is not there. Which is why the next point of Chinese economy is going to be, or it's actually happening right now, is to go back to focusing on exports. But this time, instead of exporting cheap products to the rest of the world, it's trying to export high quality tech to the rest of the world at a cheaper price. And that's why if you take a look at the numbers, you will realize that China is leading the world in exporting high-tech manufacturing. China is the largest manufacturer of electrical vehicles around the world. Even though that Tesla is the most valuable company, China sells far more electrical cars than the rest of the world. In 2022 alone, China had a far more battery capacity production than the rest of the world combined. It's also the largest producer of solar energy. It's leading the world in 5G. It's exporting high-quality smartphones and trying to compete with the United States with computer chips. Of course, China is still far behind the United States when it comes to advanced computer chips, but the gap is not really like it was 10 or 15 years ago. In 3 to 5 years, if the pace is going to be similar, it is going to catch up the United States in 5 years. So while the rest of the world can put tariffs of cheap products that China used to produce in the past, it's very difficult to limit Chinese products right now because the rest of the world needs computing power. The rest of the world needs solar panels. The rest of the world needs EVs. I mean, the cheapest EV that Tesla produces is like, what, $35,000? The cheapest EV that China is producing is less than $10,000. So even with tariffs, China is winning this battle. So China understands that as long as it produces high quality technology at a cheaper price, the rest of the world, the United States especially and Europe, will not be able to impose tariffs on China because they need this technology more than China. So by exporting high quality manufacturing to the rest of the world, China hopes that it will be able to build a large enough middle class that will drive its domestic market. Will China succeed at its plan? Well, it's really difficult to say anything right now because China will also face a very serious demographic problem in the next few decades that has been evolving over the last 20 or 30 years. But in 10 to 15 years, China might yet again find itself in the exact same situation right now, where it will not be able to force its population to spend, where the domestic market is not going to be its main driver of the economy. But if you're not in China and you have access to the US stock market, then you will be able to grow your wealth way faster than China grows its GDP, as long as you invest wisely and in the right companies. And if you check the link in the descriptions, I have a free course that will teach you, that will help you to start getting invested in the stock market. It should be the first link in the description. That's it for today, guys. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.